Research published by the Commission for Countering Extremism has found, surprise, surprise, that people are more fearful when speaking about Islam than any other religion. This comes amid a debate around the imminent Islamophobia definition that people fear will be nothing more than a backdoor blasphemy law, imposing the sensitivities of Islam on the rest of us. I'm Emma Trimble, and this is GB News Originals. But before we get stuck into all of that, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all of our latest videos. Now, joining me to dissect these findings, I am delighted to say, is the formidable Associate Professor at Cambridge University's Faculty of Divinity, James Orr. James, thank you so much for joining us today. So let me start by asking you firstly, are you surprised by this finding?
Yes, I am surprised, because I thought the percentage of Brits who would be alarmed at the incursion that Islam is making on free speech in this country would be a great deal higher than the report has stated. And in fact, I wonder whether or not it's the case that some people were too scared of speaking the truth about Islam to even say that they were scared about speaking about Islam. But nevertheless, even if we just take those numbers at face value, it does represent an alarmingly sort of disproportionate representation of a kind of the chill factor, as it were, with respect to Islam as a religion, as opposed to any other of the great religions in this country.
So what do you think the reason is for this? Because this study also found that nearly twice as many people feared talking about Islam compared to Christianity. I actually think that's quite high, because Christians are very tolerant of abuse being thrown at their religion. It's become quite a normalised part of our culture. But what do you think the reason is behind that? Is there some kind of theological difference between Christianity and Islam that perhaps makes Islam or Muslims more sensitive to criticisms of their religion compared to Christians?
I think it's definitely true that Islam tends to prioritize sanctity and purity, what's called hurma, the sanctity and purity and holiness of God, the Prophet, as they, of course, believe Muhammad to be, and indeed the Quran itself. And so there's a much greater stress both on sanctity, but also on the importance of the collective and the unity and stability of the collective. And I think this does tend to, when expressed in contemporary Western liberal democratic contexts, does tend to fuel legal and social pressures, particularly blasphemy laws or fines for burning the Quran, and this sort of general sort of chilling effect on free speech that we're seeing more recently. And I think, if you could compare that with Christianity, Christianity, yes, it's been coercive in the past, but on the whole, rather than stressing sanctity, it has tended to stress conscience, in particular freedom of conscience. In fact, I think the first ever time the phrase freedom of religion is used is by the 2nd century Latin church father Tertullian, who he actually uses the phrase libertas religionis. And freedom of speech, freedom of conscience are actually rights that have filtered into Europe through Christendom. They are downstream of freedom of religion, a freedom that was basically won by Christians in opposition, as they would try to argue, with the Roman emperors, mainly in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD, that they should, that coerced worship was not worship at all, and that therefore every subject, every citizen should have the right to pursue his or her own understanding of the fundamental questions of meaning and of divinity. So you do have this contrast, and of course, Islam, at least in the early centuries, was very much a religion of conquest. It was a religion that spread itself by the sword. Christianity wasn't afraid to use the sword, of course, in the Crusades. But generally speaking, Christianity spread primarily through acts of service, and also through reason, free inquiry, and debate from the early centuries onwards. Now, that distinction's a little bit crude, but I think basically sound, and I think that's why you see such dramatic differences when you look at global indices of free expression, free speech, journalistic freedom between Muslim majority countries and Christian or post-Christian secular countries. I think if you just cast your eye across all of those different indices and rankings, as it were, Muslim majority countries on the whole are right at the bottom of those tables. There are some exceptions. Qatar is an exception. Malaysia is an exception, where there's some sort of limited freedom for journalists and limited room for free inquiry, but they're still well below the global average. Whereas Christian majority countries do tend to populate, and post-Christian secular countries, as it were, that have inherited the norms around free speech and freedom of conscience from their Christian heritage, tend to populate the top of those tables.
I'd like to come back to your historical point there about Islam being spread by the sword in a minute. But first, just another question on the theological, consequences politically of Christianity versus Islam, because of course Christianity has this idea of the secular space, not necessarily secularism in terms of having no religion, but secularity in the sense of, not trying to perfect society in the here and now, whereas Islam doesn't really have that sort of separation. And it has this understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that all human beings are naturally Muslim, and therefore those who don't believe in Islam should also be subject to Islamic rule in the here and now. Is that one of the reasons, do you think, for this consequence that you describe in modern, traditionally Christian or traditionally Muslim states? Is that what is responsible for the presence or lack of freedom of speech?
If you think about it, Islamic political theology is much more logically consistent and predictable than Christian political theology. If you're a monotheist, that is to say, if you believe there's one God and he's in charge of absolutely everything, it's very odd to think that there might be some sort of neutral, secular public square where, in effect, you can exist and have interactions, public interactions, and devise public policy as if God doesn't in fact exist, or as if you can just be an agnostic about it. That is a very strange and peculiar invention of Christianity, primarily St. Augustine in the 5th century. Whereas Islam has always found this a very puzzling, secularism, a very puzzling doctrine. And you can understand why. If God is in charge of everything, how could there be a public square, a vital area of our common life, that is somehow free of God? So there is a sort of, in a way, Christianity's contribution is it's an unusual one. It's not one that one might have predicted. Now, of course, Augustine didn't quite mean that there should be a completely neutral, God-free public square. He simply meant that there's a distinction between state and church. There's a difference between the temporal and the eternal. And Islam's always refused that distinction for reasons that you can entirely understand. But yes, you're right. I think that definitely has shaped the sorts of norms and the sorts of protocols and conventions around things like freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and many, many other values which we take for granted in the West as a result of our Christian heritage, which are simply unintelligible within countries that trace their lineage to Islam.
And you mentioned there about the fact that Islam was spread by conquest. And that actually is something that in the original Islamophobia report, the APPG report back in 2018, that they said saying Islam is spread by the sword is an example of Islamophobic speech. And so we've recently seen these peers, over 30 peers, writing to the working group on Islamophobia, Labour's working group that's trying to come up with this new definition, to express their concerns that this non-statutory definition could potentially find its way into free speech codes in universities. Dominic Grieve, who actually wrote the foreword to that original report, he said that he actually hopes that it will be incorporated into these sorts of codes and that it will help to deal with microaggressions and so on. So do you feel that actually this is a threat? Do you agree with these peers that this is a threat to freedom of speech and academic freedom on campuses if, for example, scholars can't do historical research about how Islam might have been spread by the sword, or talk about the history of the Crusades if it takes a negative view on, the Islamic world's conquest of Christian areas before the Crusades happened and were a response to?
Yeah, it's a very good point to have raised, because I think there can be a tendency to blame the chilling effect on free speech that Islam seems to be exerting simply on British Muslims and British Muslim communities. And I think while they do bear some of the blame, they don't bear all of it. I think the state bears at least as much. And you see this, nowhere do you see this more than in this ham-fisted definition of Islamophobia from the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia. What they did, and this is something that's very, very common right across the public square, is to confuse Islam as a belief system with ethnicity and race. So that what they're trying to do is they're trying to fold Islamophobia into effectively the statutory definitions of racism, so that it carries all of the negative effects that racism has under English law. Now, there's so much to say about this, but obviously this will have a chilling effect on free speech. Obviously, it is lawful speech to criticize Islamic beliefs, just as it's unlawful to discriminate against, and that's perfectly consistent with it being unlawful to discriminate against Muslims for being Muslim. And of course, the very term Islamophobia is this confected fake term, really. It's trying to effectively leverage the political success that terms like homophobia have had in the past, and so that effectively kind of politicized Muslim groups can effectively are trying to sort of tuck themselves under that incredibly powerful protective shield and actually politically potent sword that is the sort of all the other phobia definitions have achieved elsewhere. And of course, it's very puzzling, because what is it to have a phobia? It is to have an irrational distaste for something, an irrational allergy to something. It's really a psychiatric term. And so what it's saying from the outset is that there can be no reasonable criticism of Islam. Any criticism of Islam is ipso facto, in and of itself, irrational, just the result of a strange pathology, a psychiatric condition. So, the whole term is diseased really from start to finish and presents enormous threats to freedom of speech, and especially to universities. I know that 21 universities adopted that Islamophobia definition, which unacceptably conflates criticism of Islam with anti-Muslim hatred. It's something that we need to watch very carefully. And I just want to note here the work of Nick Timothy, the Conservative MP, on this. Please go and look at his website and read his work on this and listen to his speeches on it. He's been effectively extremely courageous on it. And I think it's all important that we support Nick and sign the documents that he's urging everyone to sign, to draw greater public attention to the dangers of putting Islamophobia on, giving it this kind of statutory weight, as the government seems intent to do.
So could you explain this concept of culture race that is the kind of philosophical roots of this conflation between race and religion? Because I think a lot of people will criticize this and say, well, you're accusing me of being racist because I have criticized a religion. But of course, for those who believe in this concept of culture race, that isn't fallacious in any way. They think that that's absolutely justified.
Well, I think that makes no sense at all. We know that white Europeans are converting to Islam in unprecedented numbers. We know that in Britain's prisons, offenders, white British, as it were, Christian or secular offenders, are converting to Islam, because that's the way to get easy protection in prison. And if you look at global Islam, it's made up of all kinds of ethnicities and races. There's Southeastern Asian Islam, of course, in Malaysia and elsewhere. There's Arab Middle Eastern Islam, of course, but there's Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. So Islam, it sees itself as a universal global religion. It does not see itself as an ethnically based or racially based religion, as, for example, Judaism does by and large. So, it's not in fact being true, or as it were, faithful to Islam's own understanding of itself, to think of criticism of it as, in and of itself, criticism of some race or ethnicity. It's just a muddled and confused conflation.
And of course, they will, talk about the ways in which certain criticisms of Islam can be instrumentalized as a way of attacking Muslims. For example, talking about the Prophet Muhammad in a negative way or talking about the Quran in a negative way. And one of these findings is that 38% of people felt that they have to hold back their views, non-Muslims this is, when talking about issues to do with Muhammad and the Quran. What are the most egregious examples that you can think of cases where there have been quite serious ramifications that maybe justify this 38%, or possibly even higher? I would have expected this to be higher.
Well, I just to start with, I mean, I find it very puzzling that the concern or the fear that's being expressed is that it's non-Muslim Europeans who risk inciting violence and hatred and social ostracism against Muslims. Because if anything, it seems to be the other way round. We live in a country where a school teacher is still in hiding after 4 years up in Batley after showing the Muhammad cartoons that were shown at that showed the Charlie Hebdo caricature. That prompted massive protests outside the school. It prompted death threats. And as I said, he's still in hiding. And there are lots of other examples too. I mean, earlier this year, remember we had the incident of the Quran burning. Now, I think burning a Quran is needlessly provocative. It is ill-mannered. It is rude. It's distasteful. But it should not be illegal. It should not be unlawful. And nobody thinks that if any other holy book or sacred scripture had been publicly burned, there would have been that kind of reaction. Again, partly from Muslims, but mainly from the state. The police fined the man £240 for a so-called religiously aggravated public order offence. And I think it turned out that what the man was charged with, I think Robert Jenrick pointed this out, was not in fact a crime. But, such was the sort of reflexive willingness of the police to crack down on any criticism of Islam, even, albeit a very, provocative and I think needlessly provocative one. It shows just what sort of double standards are being applied to this religion and this religion alone. Or think of the Wakefield Quran row. I think it was a couple of years ago where those boys were suspended for scuffing a Quran, and there was that extraordinary struggle session where this poor autistic boy and his mother were, as it were, hauled in front of representatives of the Muslim community by police, if I recall, and asked to give a sort of public mea culpa in front of the TV cameras. I mean, I think it was just monstrous. We're pretty lucky in Britain. I mean, we haven't, for example, been as unfortunate as France. I mean, I'm thinking back to 2020 with the decapitation of a school teacher, Samuel Paty, because for allegedly showing cartoons of Muhammad. This is sort of vigilante justice. And now the perpetrators and the accomplices were put on trial. It was dealt with, but that has an extraordinarily chilling effect. Has had an extraordinarily chilling effect, not just on France, but on any European country with a significant Muslim minority that would have read those reports. And so, we could go on and on and on. The examples are endless, but I don't think there's much doubt that the empirical case supporting the fears of those 38% that Islam is indeed imposing a chilling effect on free speech is irrefutable.
Well, these things, they're often downstream from culture, things like this Islamophobia definition. Do you feel that actually as diversity increases, as the Muslim population increases, that we will be seeing much more of this, that it will become worse, that actually this is the new status quo, and that in a multicultural society, it's not actually possible to have the freedom of speech that we had when we were a more cohesive, culturally cohesive society, founded on, as you described earlier, principles that emerged from Christianity, from a very particular cultural milieu?
Yes, it's a very good point. And I think I would say, leaving Islam to one side for a moment, it is certainly true that not only is diversity not our strength, it is a debilitating weakness. It's not necessarily a debilitating weakness that we can't overcome. It has been overcome in places like Singapore, but only at the cost of a very authoritarian intrusion by the state over society, ensuring effectively policing the boundaries between different ethnicities, different races, different belief systems. And it's true that the more, broadly speaking, the more cohesive a society, the more it shares a set of norms and as it were, moral reflexes, the less need you have for law, the less need you have for the police to enforce the law. There's a genuine general understanding of what's right and wrong, or a general understanding that is shared rather of what's right and wrong. It's not necessarily forming a judgment here about whether those codes, code X is better than code Y. It's simply saying that where there's a single moral code in one single moral community, as opposed to many, the chances are, and all the evidence suggests that this is the case, that you're going to have a much more cohesive society with all of the most propitious conditions for common flourishing.
What do you think that the solution is then, given it seems that the diversity that we have now is inevitable? I mean, there are lots of people who are so concerned about this that they are talking about things like civil war, and it's something that David Betts has talked about. We do have an increasing sectarian politics with a number of independent MPs in Parliament, but it's something that poses actually a real threat to many Labour MPs in very constituencies that have a very large Muslim population. What is the solution here in order to protect free speech in the long term? Because this, of course, is not just about your average Brit. I mean, obviously, this research has also found that this is particularly affecting older white working class men who particularly feel that they can't say anything at all. But it also affects Muslims. It affects Muslims who dissent, because it is effectively imposing a blasphemy law on the rest of society, on those who don't take a particular view, perhaps of the Prophet Muhammad, who do want to question certain unsavory aspects of Islamic history. So how do you, under these circumstances, protect freedom of speech?
Mm-hmm. Well, I noted earlier, Emma, that it's extraordinary the extent to which Muslim-majority countries dominate the very bottom of all these global indices on free expression, journalistic freedom, and freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. If the numbers are to be believed, it's perfectly plausible that Britain will become a Muslim majority, or at least a Muslim plurality country, by the end of this century. And I think it's implausible to suppose that a Muslim majority Britain will somehow buck the trend or be an exception to that very, very clear pattern that we're seeing in those league tables. And so I think, there's a very tight correlation between the number of the dominance that Islam has in a country and the abuses and constraints on free speech and freedom of religion. What's the solution? Well, quite obviously, to arrest and preferably reverse mass unvetted migration from those parts of the world that don't take free speech or freedom of conscience or freedom of religion as seriously as we do. And as I said, if those tables are to be believed, and there's no reason not to believe them, those countries are Muslim majority countries, particularly Pakistan, particularly Afghanistan. These are, in my view, backward moral cultures. And even if you don't think they're backward, they're certainly strictly incompatible with the moral culture that Britain can rightly be proud of, and particularly when it comes to issues of freedom of speech and freedom of conscience.
And certainly, importantly, don't introduce things like an Islamophobia definition that's going to make the situation much, much worse.
Yes, absolutely. Or don't introduce the Prevent programme, which was introduced by the Tories, I think, about 15 years ago, and that now seems to be used. It really was a government measure to address the problem of radical Islam in universities and elsewhere. And now we see is being effectively used to target a completely confected phenomenon, namely the far right, evidence for which is, according to William Shawcross's report, reading C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Douglas Murray. More people have been investigated for far-right extremism, 20%, under Prevent, than Islamism, 16%. And so the state is, as I said, at least as much to blame as Muslim communities who ought to be trying to get their house in order.
I think the police are going to be knocking at your door wanting to inspect your bookshelves, James. Thank you so much.
Looking forward
for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments, and stay up to date with all of GB News Originals content.